For roughly 100,000 years, two different human species shared the same planet, us and the Neanderthals. Then, within just a few thousand years, one of them was gone. The question that's been asked for over a century and is still genuinely unresolved is simple. Did we kill them? Start with what we actually know for certain, because it's stranger than either we fought them or we ignored them. In 2010, a team led by Svante Pääbo sequenced the Neanderthal genome for the first time, work that won him the Nobel Prize in 2022, and it proved something remarkable. Nearly everyone alive today whose ancestry isn't purely African carries Neanderthal DNA, not a trace, 1 to 2% of your actual genome on average. That alone rules out simple total war as the whole story. But newer research shows it wasn't one clean moment of mixing either. A 2019 study found evidence of at least 2 separate pulses of interbreeding, thousands of years apart. Then, in December 2024, an even more detailed genetic reconstruction, published in Science, narrowed the main event to a window of about 7,000 years, centered roughly 47,000 years ago. Whatever was happening between these two species, it happened repeatedly, over a very long stretch of time. And it wasn't abstract. In Romania, a modern human jawbone dated to around 40,000 years old turned out, when sequenced, to have a Neanderthal ancestor just 4 to 6 generations back. In Bulgaria, genomes from a nearly identical time window show the same thing. These weren't distant, occasional encounters. These were direct family lines, forming right at the edge of contact between the two populations in real time. So the two species weren't just fighting. At some point, and apparently more than once, they were also having children together. That complicates the question of war considerably, but it doesn't fully answer it, because interbreeding and violence aren't mutually exclusive in human history. They coexist constantly. So look at the timeline itself. A 2022 study at a site called Mandrin in France found a modern human tooth dated to around 54,000 years old in a layer sandwiched between Neanderthal occupation layers above it and below it, suggesting the two species may have taken turns using the exact same shelter. On the other end, the most rigorous redating of last Neanderthal sites across Europe, published in Nature in 2014, put their final disappearance at around 39 to 41,000 years old, with a real overlap between the two species of a few thousand years in most regions. One particularly famous last Neanderthal date from Gorham's Cave in Gibraltar claimed a population survived there until as recently as 24,000 years ago, a claim that's now widely considered an artifact of older, contaminated radiocarbon methods, not a real data point, worth knowing because that number still circulates. Given a real overlap of thousands of years across a shared landscape, is there any actual physical evidence of violence between the two species? There is exactly one well-known case, and it's worth being honest about how weak it is. A Neanderthal skeleton called Shanidar III from a cave in Iraq has a puncture wound in one rib that partially healed before he eventually died. In 2009, researchers argued the wound's shape was more consistent with a throwing projectile than a thrusting spear, and since Neanderthals mostly used heavy thrusting spears while modern humans had projectile weapons, they raised the possibility, cautiously, that a Homo sapiens might have thrown it. The lead researcher himself was explicit that this wasn't proof of anything like organized conflict, and that a hunting accident or an injury from another Neanderthal explains the wound just as well. There's no second confirmed case like it anywhere in the record. Meanwhile, the explanations that don't require any violence at all have gotten a lot stronger. Neanderthal populations appear to have been small and fragmented, which on its own can be enough to drive a species toward a collapse through simple inbreeding and bad luck. Climate swung wildly during this period, including a massive volcanic eruption around 39,000 years ago that would have stressed already marginal populations. New diseases may have arrived with incoming modern humans, and the interbreeding itself may have mattered more than anyone assumed. If modern human populations were simply larger, generation after generation of mixing could have genetically absorbed the smaller Neanderthal population rather than replace it by force. In 2021, a survey of over 200 practicing paleoanthropologists found a real, fairly recent consensus forming around exactly that: demographic factors, not conflict, as the leading explanation. And there's a real named debate underneath that consensus worth naming directly. Archaeologist Rebecca Ragg Sykes has argued that the entire brutal caveman wiped out by superior humans story traces back to 19th century interpretations built on shaky evidence and a skeleton later shown to have severe arthritis, not primitive brutality, a myth more than a finding. Researchers, including Chris Stringer and Zhao Zilhao, have separately argued that assimilation through interbreeding, not warfare, is simply the better supported explanation for where the Neanderthals actually went. So honestly, probably not war, not in the sense of organized, sustained conflict between two populations. What the evidence actually supports is something slower and stranger. Two human species living alongside each other, sometimes in the same shelter, occasionally starting families together for thousands of years, until one of them, smaller and more fragmented to begin with, simply stopped existing as a separate population. That's an odd episode to include in this series on war, but it belongs here for exactly that reason. Not every disappearance in the human story is a war, even when it looks at a glance like exactly one should have been there. Two populations, one survives. It's tempting to assume conflict explains that gap every single time, and the honest answer in this specific case is that the evidence mostly points somewhere else. What doesn't disappear is the deeper pattern underneath it. 100,000 years of two human species sharing one planet, sometimes generously, sometimes not, ending the same way most contact between unequal populations tends to end throughout this series, not always with a battle, but with one population quietly absorbing or outlasting the other. Sometimes that takes a spear, sometimes it just takes time.